Hi, Misha here, and it's time for another American Army helicopter video. I've already covered this one in a few different videos. This is the Bell AH-1. This is the H variant, as it happens. Huey, which was a utility helicopter. And in this video, I'm going to cover the Bell AH-1 Cobra, or Huey Cobra as it was sometimes known. This is a dedicated attack version with no transport capability. This is a 1/48 scale model from Corgi, one of the few 1/48s I own. This is a early 70s G model. And over here I have a little 1/72 scale model from Amercom, which is an AH-1S, a more recent version. This is analogous to one used by the Israeli Air Force and Army, but quite a lot like late styles used. And of course this Huey over here is another 1/48 scale from Air Force One that's been in a few videos in the past. Now I'm not going to get into the Huey history here because I've done a couple of different videos. But by 1962, Bell was having great success with the Huey. And already at this point, the Army is considering arming Hueys up with guns and rockets to make gunships out of them. In the early 60s, the concept of a helicopter gunship was very new. And in June of that year, 1962, Bell kind of showed not a mock-up, let's call it. Not a prototype or anything, but a mock-up of what they called the Iroquois Warrior. The Huey, of course, known as the Iroquois. Well, the Warrior used basically the same engine, transmission, all that good stuff, but it had a slimline body, no troop carrying capability, and it had a two-seat tandem cockpit, and it had stub wings for attaching ordnance. Plus it could have a gun mounted under the nose. Well, the Army brass liked this concept, and so in December of that year, they funded kind of a proof of concept development, and Bell got to work there. They started with the company's Model 47, kind of transforming it into Model 207, known as the Sioux Scout. And this first flew in the summer of 1963 as a prototype. And the Army evaluated it into 1964. And they liked the concept, they liked what it did, but they felt that it was underpowered, a little too small, not quite survivable enough, not enough armor. And so to that end, they kind of said, thanks but no thanks, good idea, but we want something a little more advanced. Bell would continue developing in-house, using its own money, the idea, whereas the Army would start the AAFSS program. And interestingly, Bell was not invited. But this is for an advanced gunship. But by 1965, the weather was changing. For one, the war in Vietnam was heating up drastically. Many more boots on the ground, and the need for escorting Hueys was getting up and up. They tried arming Hueys, and they did well as gunships, but they weren't designed for that. Meanwhile, the need for true air cavalry was more and more apparent. I mean, they needed mobility to deliver troops and pick them up at a moment's notice. They needed something to escort these Hueys, as well as provide fire support from above and attack some targets and all kinds of stuff. Well, the AAFSS program basically got bogged down. It got too convoluted. They were pushing too hard for advancements, political infighting, funding, plus the changes in Vietnam. So by June of 1965, the Army said, we need an interim aircraft. We need an interim helicopter, attack helicopter, escort helicopter, close support helicopter, and we need it yesterday. We need something that's ready to go. So basically the idea was to take something from existing aircraft and just, make it an attack version. So to that end, 5 companies responded, including Bell, but we also had Kamen take a version of its Sea Sprite. We had Boeing Vertol. We had Sikorsky. But here's the thing. Bell had been working on their design for years now. By September 3rd, they rolled out their first prototype of what they called the Model 209. And by September 7, it first took to the air. So it was just light years ahead of the competition. So to very little surprise, in April 1966, Boeing was awarded a contract to produce initially 110 of the new helicopter for the U.S. Army. And what's interesting, the Model 209 was extremely similar to the Iroquois Warrior, first proposed all the way back in 1962. Had a tandem cockpit, stub wings. Bell focused on making this more armored, give it a more powerful single engine. It could carry more payload. And it was pretty much ready to go. They made a few changes when they put it into mass production. For example, they went to a wider rotor blade, but it still used the engine and transmission from the Huey, so that was ready to go. Also, the prototype had retractable skids. Cool, but kind of added unnecessary complexity, so they just went to standard fixed skids. And also, the prototype had a very heavily armored, very survivable cockpit, but at the same time, it was just very heavy. So they went to just more conventional plexiglass with kind of a bubble contour on the outside. But either way, in 1966, Bell would start working on the first production order. And by June of 1967, the first Cobras, as they were designated or known, were in Vietnam. Now, interestingly, this was initially considered completely just part of the AH-1 family. So much so that the first designation the Army went to use was actually AH-1H, which was at the time the next one available. The attack nomenclature wasn't ready yet. But very soon this would be known as the AH-1G. And that UH-1H designation would actually go to this here, which was an uprated, improved UH-1D, which is the long body version. And so these two would be side by side. The Huey would be the transport. Still, sometimes they would arm these, of course, but that left the Cobra as the gunship, the attacker. And this was really the first attack helicopter in the U.S. Army, dedicated attack helicopter, I should say, and one of the first in the war, in the world. Russia had worked on some as well at this point. In fact, the Hind is not far behind. But yeah. And then its rather legendary service in Vietnam would begin. So the Army flew the AH-1G Cobra as intended as an escort, close air support, fire suppression. It was also used in what they would consider hunter-killer missions, where these would operate alongside an AH-6A. The AH-6 would essentially work as as bait, to put it bluntly, flushing out any hidden enemy in the jungle, and then once they would pop up, the Cobras would sweep in and deal quite a bit of death. They were very successful for what they were. They gave great visibility. They were as survivable as any helicopter of that era could be expected to be. Early on, they pretty much carried machine guns and rockets. And over 1,000 would be delivered to the U.S. Army between 1967 and 1973. This really was the backbone of the Army's offensive air capability. And the Marines went in on this action too. They really liked the AH-1G, but they wanted a twin-engine version for operating over water, and also so it could have better payload and especially carry a big gun. A lot of these early Cobras were just armed with .30 caliber guns. At first, the Marines weren't getting much joy, but by 1968 May, they were given the go-ahead to order the twin-engine version from Bell, with an initial contract for 49. And the twin-engine version would first fly the prototype in 1969, and so then Bell would get to work on the production. In the interim, the Army would basically give the Marines around 38 AH-1G single-engine versions to use, and they would fly these in Vietnam. And Bell would have the first ones delivered, and they would start to go into service in 1971. And by June of 1972, they were sent over into theater. So between then and December of that year, they would operate at the tail end of the Vietnam War under the Marines. These would be known as the AH-1J C Cobra, like SEA Cobra. And the early missions were basically what they considered Marine hunter-killer missions. They would fly over the Ho Chi Minh Trail, disrupting supplies. In 1972, the Army started a program to kind of upgrade the weaponry, which led to testing the Cobra with the TOW guided anti-tank missile, which led to the adoption of an upgraded version known as the AH-1Q, which could use the TOW missile. The Marines would also get in on this action. They would get the AH-1T, which had upgraded engines, and could also use the TOW missile. Then finally in 1976, the Army would start to get the AH-1S, which had an upgraded engine. And this would kind of be the definitive version in the single engine line. Cobras are very much still in service during the invasion of Grenada. 3 were lost, but they also did destroy many pieces of armor on the ground, and they escorted many other aircraft. In the mid-80s, the Marines would introduce the AH-1W, an uprated, modernized version. Actually, in 1981, the Marines wanted to get in on the new AH-64 Apache, but Congress denied them. And the reason was the Marines would have needed a maritime version of the Apache, which they saw as too expensive to develop, and they didn't think there'd be enough takers to warrant having a whole other product. So they just kept on with the Cobra. Interestingly, in 1988, the Marines deployed their Cobras, or I should really call them Sea Cobras, because that's more correct, in the Persian Gulf. This was towards the end of the Iran-Iraq War. Iran had threatened Kuwaiti oil tankers and platforms. Interestingly, at this point, Kuwait and Iraq were allies, so Iran was threatening the seas and just basically being dicks and disrupting international movement. So the Marines sent helicopters to basically interdict any of their vessels or aircraft trying to make trouble. They'd previously been used with this in earlier times. I should also point out that in the 80s, the Cobra and Sea Cobra were updated to use AIM-9 Sidewinder missiles, as well as the new Hellfire missile, kind of developed alongside the the Apache helicopter. So they're continuing to upgrade the ordnance these can carry with the most cutting edge. But yeah, these were used very successfully against Iranian assets. They destroyed 2 platforms, ocean platforms, that the Iranians had control of. They also sunk 3 or 4 smaller boats that Iran had. They took down a missile destroyer, as well as a frigate. And the cost was 1 Sea Cobra. I should point out, just, to give credit, back in Grenada, 3 of these were lost to combats being shot down. So, credit where credit was due. During the Gulf War, well, I should say Operation Desert Shield and then into Operation Desert Storm, so 1990-1991, both the Army and the Marines stationed their Cobras in the Gulf. Even though the Apache was starting to come online, the Cobra was still instrumental in the Army. And in January of 91, when the invasion of Iraq happened and they were pushing them out of Kuwait, the Army would field over 140 of the AH-1S version, and the Marines would have 80 or 90, depending on which source, of their newest AH-1Ws. And these would do much the same roles they'd always done: close air support, escort missions, kind of reconnaissance. They popped a lot of armor. For example, they destroyed 97 Iraqi tanks. They shot up at least 104 other armored military vehicles, and even took out a couple of anti-aircraft batteries. A couple would be lost, but not being shot down. They would just be lost to operational accidents, which always happens during large-scale military maneuvers. It's just what happens. Some of these get lost in training from year to year too. Cobras would again be used in Somalia, Haiti, the former Yugoslavia, all throughout the 1990s. Again in 1996, the Marines would petition to go to the new Apache, but again it would be denied, so they just continued to modernize their fleet. Eventually this would lead to them signing a contract to Bell to upgrade theirs to the new AH-1Z or Z standard. This was an internal corporate company design from Bell. Basically it was a four-bladed version, modernized and improved. Pretty much the final version in the single engine line would be the AH-1F. The Israeli one we'll look at in just a minute has some of its upgrades, so we'll talk about those in just a second. But by 1999, the Army had pulled their remaining AH-1s out of active service deployment. By this point, they had not only the Apache, but the Apache Longbow was coming online. And then in September of 2001, they would pull their remaining Cobras out of reserve service. At this time, they would offer surplus examples that had low flight hours to NATO allies. Some would take them up, some wouldn't. But this is pretty much the end of Army service. But the Marines would keep theirs around. They would use them in 2003 during the invasion of Iraq. And they would also be used in Afghanistan. And are still in use today, in 2020. Although this year, it's scheduled that all of the AH-1Ws either should be retired or upgraded to the AH-1Z so-called Viper configuration. So the newest versions are supposedly going to be completely taking over from the older ones this year. So what about the Snake, as it was called, and other nations' services? Because it was definitely not just exclusively an American helicopter. Not surprisingly, one of the first foreign users was Israel, who started to receive these in the 70s. I kind of honestly forget exactly when, but since the U.S. was getting out of Vietnam and then didn't have a need, Israel was start to receive. This particular model here is, like I said, from Amercom. It's circa 1998 and is of the, well, they say AH-1S, but it seems a lot like the AH-1F because basically Bell introduced, starting in the 80s, running through the 90s, kind of a series of 3 upgrade packages. And this has a lot of the features. For example, it has the updated composite rotor blades, which is something, of course, a lot of helicopters started to switch to in the 80s and 90s. It also has the updated flat cockpit glass, kind of restoring some more of that armor ability. Also has uprated engines, but can't really tell that from the outside. It has modernized communications gear, and this one can carry the newer weapons like TOW missiles and Hellfire. It also has the bigger 20mm cannon installed. So Israel would be a major user. They would deploy these along the Lebanon front for over 2 decades, especially in the war in 82-83. It was kind of instrumental. and they would eventually retire the last of theirs, around 30 of them, in 2013, switching over to the Apache for attack helicopter and for unmanned aerial vehicles to kind of take over the reconnaissance patrol route that these used to fulfill. Another major foreign user was Japan. Beginning in 1984, Fuji would manufacture these under license, building 89 over the years. And as far as I know, they still are in Japanese Air Self-Defense Force service, at least in one capacity or another, although, like most, they've been phased out by the Apache in active service, which they also have built a few of, but I think the problem with the Apache ended up being more expensive than they bargained for. And there are many, many other foreign users besides. Like I said, after the U.S. Army was pretty much retiring theirs, they would offer them to allies and sell them as surplus beginning in the late 90s. So what is the AH-1 Huey Cobra, as Bell called it? Really, aside from being thin, it has a lot of the same dimensions as the UH-1, which is kind of funny, a transport helicopter and whatnot. Again, it uses the same engines, transmission, even very similar rotor blades. There are several versions. The initial Army G version would have a body just under 45 feet long. It had a stub wingspan of just under 10.5 feet with 4 hard points. It used a turret under the nose that had 2 mounting points in it. Initially, they could have either a 7.62 Gatling gun or 40 millimeter grenade launcher. They could do either 2 of each or 1 and 1. So very configurable there. Pretty much when they started off, their main armament were 70 millimeter rockets. Like I said, later they would be upgraded to use TOW missiles. They had a max speed of about 170 miles per hour and an altitude of about 11,400 feet. Of course, we had a crew of 2. The pilot would actually sit in the back, giving him a little higher commanding view. The co-pilot and gunner, and to some extent navigator, would sit in the front. Upgraded versions like the 1S would have much the same specs, except they would be given newer weapons. They would increase the maximum altitude slightly to 12,200 feet. And they would go a little bit faster, a couple of miles per hour faster, but that really wasn't the point of those. And the later versions of the single engine, like the S and F, could mount the 20 millimeter cannon using a new model of turret. As for the Marines, their initial J version, the twin engine version, the Sea Cobra, was a little faster. She could go about 175 miles per hour. A little bit longer. It just a smidge under 46 foot long for the body, not counting the rotors. Had a little bit wider wingspan of about a little under 11 feet. So just a little bit bigger all in all. Because of its extra weight, though, it had a slightly lower maximum altitude of about 10,500 feet. In addition to the 70mm rockets, it could also carry Zuni rockets. And instead of having the 30 caliber machine gun and or 40mm grenade launcher in the turret, it would commonly have a 3-barrel 20mm cannon with 750 rounds on board. So kind of like on this Israeli version here. Later versions that the Marines used, like the 1W, often called the Super Cobra in place of Sea Cobra, would have uprated engines and the like. They would get a higher maximum altitude of about 12,000 feet. They would be fully compatible with the Hellfire missile as well as the TOW missile. They would also get the hard points on the stub wings for sidewinders, as well as modern communications equipment, navigation, night, and to some extent some night vision compatibility. They would be quite a bit faster at nearly 190 miles per hour. But even though they had a higher max altitude, the Marines like to fly them low and dirty. They like to just get in there, hug the ground, and because that's their role. Very interesting helicopter. I don't think I mentioned the Israelis designated theirs the Viper, or Zephyr, or Zephyr in Hebrew. I don't know, just a thing. The Viper name seems to have stuck again, like the newer ones, like the Z. They're unofficially known as the Viper. But I guess it's a little more menacing than just Cobra. I don't know. Growing up, this was the attack helicopter. I mean, the Apache was coming in when I was getting to be a teenager, but as a little kid, this was like the mean, sleek ship. And when a lot of movies had Hueys, and that was cool, and everyone knew the Huey. This was just the helicopter. But this is more a sign of what it could carry, troops coming down or, getting troops off the ground. This bird was just aggressive in and of its own right. Turreted guns, rockets, they could just load them up with dozens of rockets and just pepper the trees. And then they introduced the TOW missiles that just met them. And then, of course, they had the sidewinders, so these could go air to air, air to ground, anything. It was very survivable for what it was, and also, frankly, pretty economical for an American aircraft. At least compared to what would come later. Funnily enough, because of the AAFSS, this was always considered to be just a simple stopgap, interim solution back in 65, 66. The thing is, the AAFSS program just kind of got bogged down and eventually went nowhere. So it got shit-canned. And the Cobra that resulted from it is still flying today in modernized form. And even in the Army, it served for, the better part of, over 30 years, a little under 40, but pretty substantial record for something. But, there and again, Bell seemed like they believed in it early on more than anyone else, and the fact that they kept going ahead is probably why it is what it is today. As to the models themselves, Okay, in the diecast world, you can find a lot of Apaches. Different scales, plastic, metal, what have you. You can barely find any Cobras. And I don't know why. This from Corgi, like I said, is 148. It's a really good model, but I would have really been happier if they had done them at 172. But you can't find them even in 148. These are old models. I don't think they've made these in over 10 years. So in the end, I picked this up because better to have something than nothing, right? And Hobby Master doesn't do one. I don't think they ever have. And you know, the Amercom model is pretty good. Really it is. It's got a pretty good bit of weight. The body's all metal. The turret even moves, which is cool. Rotating blades. The only problem with these, the blades they come with, they don't stay in well. I can't really blame them because they're so big. So if you get one, just know you'll probably have to put a dot of glue to hold them in. But once that, they seem to stay on pretty well. They're also kind of made of this interesting material that kind of feels like a emery board for your fingernails. I know they were trying to replicate the composite rotor blade, and they did an interesting job. I think it's neat. Still want to knock it over, guys. Yeah, I think it's definitely one of Amercom's good attempts because, yeah, for some reason they don't put pilots in their helicopters, but they do their planes. And of course, Amercom would have fixed landing gear in the down position, but since this has fixed skids anyway, it doesn't really matter. It's good this model is pretty nice because they're cheap, but also because no one else does them. This is the only 172 scale I could find anywhere. The only other ones were in the plastic models, like easy models. I've read that Altea used to do Cobras, but I've looked high and low and I cannot find an Altea Cobra, so I don't know if that's just whatnot. A lot of times Altea and Amercom do the same things, and I think Alteas are a little higher quality, so I would have loved to have found an Altea Cobra, but at this point I'll take what I can get, and this is what I could get. One 172 scale from Amercom, which luckily was like 15 bucks, and one 148 scale from Corgi, which was like 50 bucks back then, but I think nowadays they're bumping close to 100 just because you cannot get them anymore. Interestingly, they did a Forest Service version of this. A lot of the surplus ones were transferred to the National Forest Service, and they used them to fight fires. There's some versions that are just like fire spotters, patrol, but there are some that are equipped with firefighting equipment, which is really cool. I'm halfway tempted to try to pick one of those up while they're still available. They don't sell as quickly because they're not all armored like a military version, but I still think they're neat. This variant here is circa 1973 U.S. Army. They also have the same G variant, circa 1970, 71 in U.S. Marine livery. But since it's basically the same exact chopper, I just never saw a reason to have both. And again, I brought out the Huey because it's the only other 148 scale helicopter I've got. Actually, I bought this one by mistake years ago because it was in the 172 section of a website. And I did realize it was 148 before it even came, but I thought, Hueys aren't exactly easy to find either. I'll keep it. And this is a U.S. Army, like I said, H model. It might be the only H I own, I can't remember. I do have some twin Hueys. You can see them in my big Huey video I did a while back. But no, I like Air Force 1. They make very good, durable models. The only problem is sometimes they have like seam lines or screws showing, but on the other hand, they're relatively cheap. This is like 40 bucks or 50 bucks. And it's heavy. It's all metal. I think even the skids are metal. And it's got the clear cockpit and clear rear seats and doors and stuff, so it's cool. I just thought I'd bring it out for kind of a size comparison with the Cobra. Plus, it didn't make it into my Huey video because I couldn't get to it well that day. So I didn't want to short shrift it. They're both cool. And taken on their own, I don't mind them being 148, but just to match the rest of my collection, I sure wish they were 172. I feel the same way about my British F4 Phantom, like I said earlier in the last year, but you can do it what you can. But I like the Apache, I really do. But I have to say, I think the Cobra is just a little cooler. It's so thin and so just minimalist. Very Vietnam. And again, it's what I grew up with, was being the attack gunship of the U.S. Army and Marines. And the Marines must be pretty fond of it too. Even though that they have tried to go to the Apache a couple of times over the years. They seem, at least the pilots do still seem quite taken with this, and it's been used to great effect in recent years in Afghanistan and Iraq and other places. Of course, most foreign users have started to retire theirs because getting spare parts and maintenance are getting harder and harder just because it is aging tech. On the other hand, newer helicopters like the Apache are pretty dang expensive, so yeah. Well, I wanted to do a good tribute to the Bell Huey Cobra, so I hope you found this enjoyable. If you haven't already, you might check out my videos on the Huey. By the way, I don't think I really said, but the quality on this is typical Corgi. They put the screw holes in the bottom, and oh, it's very heavy. Yeah, it's even heavier, I think, than the Air Force 1. But that's Corgi for you. They're very good about doing a lot of metal. The thing kind of weird about it is the blades spin, but when you kind of pull them up, when they're kind of sit down, lay down. I think that's to keep them from spinning too freely on the thing. Alrighty guys, I'm going to call it a night. I appreciate you tuning in. If you could, like, share, and subscribe, and all that other good stuff. This is Misha. Catch you very soon next time.